Omar, you gotta start playing the drums.
When aren't I? I'm back here like this.
I knew it. Hola, welcome everybody. I am super excited for tonight's panel. Welcome to the Afro-Latinx panel, Aqui, Estamos, meaning we are here. Tonight's panel will center the voices of Afro-Latinx to discuss the intersectionality between two cultures and their lived experiences among two cultures. Representation matters is a phrase commonly used, but what if it still leaves some people out? And that's exactly why we're having this conversation tonight. Our panel includes a strong group of community leaders that push for more Afro-Latinx representation through their work in architecture, urban planning, education, community organizing, and more. But before I introduce the panelists, I want to welcome my co-host, Catherine Hernandez. Born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, Catherine has an extensive background in community organizing, policy, and the built environment. She leads an architecture studio where she creates service-enhanced, affordable housing and socially beneficial community facilities that promote the social, economic, and physical transformation of underserved communities. She's a housing advocate in her field and supports various organizations throughout Southern California, ranging from tenant unions to policy development, pushing for housing for all. Currently, she co-organizes with Designers Protest to hold the profession accountable in reversing the violence and injustice that architecture, design, and urban planning practices that have inflicted upon Black people and communities. Additionally, she has led youth workshops, summer camps, and portfolio reviews to empower youth to affect change in their community through design. Welcome, Catherine. I couldn't have asked for a better co-host for this panel tonight.
Thank you. So excited for this.
All right, so our first panelist will be Carmen Suero, a principal at Good Project Company, has been involved with projects across various sectors that include rail and aviation projects for MTA and LAWA civic projects for the City of Long Beach and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, educational, hospitality, as well as residential projects. Carmen is currently a member of the executive board for the Southern California chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects, also known as NOMA. She is also co-chairing the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for AIA Los Angeles and is this year's state representative for the Small Practice Exchange at AIA National. Alongside her practice, Carmen is actively pursuing an educational doctorate degree at the University of Southern California with a focus on the processes of learning and practice within architecture and the relationships to representation in the industry. Welcome, Carmen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm really excited to get to share this space with all of you tonight.
We also have Ricardo de Jesús Maga Rojas. Growing up in Cuba, Ricardo Jesús Maga Rojas, associate AIA NOMA, met just one architect when he enrolled in his high school drafting magnet program. Since then, he has yet to meet an architect of African descent and Cuban heritage, an absence that fuels his dream to become a licensed architect and reshape the profession to be more reflective of him and other architects of color. Through his leadership and boundless enthusiasm, Maga Rojas plays a significant role in igniting needed change in his chapter, firm, and the city of Austin. Maga Rojas' passion for service emerged during his time at Tuskegee University and followed him to Texas A&M University. After relocating to Austin, he quickly rolled up his sleeves to assist his new chapter and the city at large. He has served on multiple AIA Austin committees, including Latinos in Architecture, and on the board of directors as membership community building commissioner. In his multifaceted roles, he has steered the committee through COVID-19 and reevaluations of their budgets and activities to focus on racial justice. Welcome, Ricardo Jesús Maga Rojas.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
Absolutely. We also have Vanessa Torres. Vanessa is a Puerto Rican-born architect based in Miami, Florida. She has received a bachelor's from Northeastern University and a master's of architecture from Tulane University. She has worked on award-winning projects in various market sectors from hospitality to education. She is a visiting instructor at Florida Atlantic University, where she serves on the College of Arts and Letters, Diversity and Inclusion, and and Committee. Committed to building a more equitable profession, Vanessa has served on the National Organization of Minority Architects chapter boards in South Florida and Louisiana. She's the immediate past president of Noma and currently serves as the chapter director of AIA Miami and co-chair of the Women in Architecture Committee. Thank you, Vanessa, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation tonight.
And last but not least, Omar Mora. Omar Mora is an educator with over 15 years of experience in Title I public schools. He has a passion for providing every student with the educational opportunities and experiences necessary to fully cultivate their individual potential. Mr. Mora began his career in education as a secondary teacher. There he taught multiple subjects in the humanities, history, ELA, philosophy, speech, and debate. Additionally, Mr. Mora taught in a specialty secondary Montessori program as well. Out of the classroom, Mr. Mora has been a restorative justice trainer, an assistant principal, and a middle school principal. He attended Arizona State University to receive his undergraduate baccalaureate degree in African and African American Studies. He later continued graduate study and earned his Master's of Arts in Social and Cultural Pedagogy and a second Master's in Education and Educational Leadership. Mr. Mora was born in New York City and spent his time in his formative years in New England. Having resided in the Valley of the Sun for 30 plus years, he considers himself a native of Arizona. He is very rooted in his Afro-Latino culture, himself a first-generation born American to immigrants from the Dominican Republic. Ultimately, his leadership style is deeply informed by his cultural background. Wow. What a panel that we have tonight. And that is it. That concludes our panelists for the night. Before we proceed with our event, I would like to just quickly remind everybody, if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please put it in the chat so that when we have the Q&A session at the end, we can quickly get to the questions. And we're going to be dropping some links as well for any references and other articles and things for you all to check out on your own time. But before we get to the questions, we're going to have Omar give us a few facts on the Afro-Latinx diaspora. And through the conversation, we're going to get to learn about each individual story and how this all connects in together and how they're different at the same time. So Omar, take it away.
All right, thank you. And thank you again for the amazing, wonderful introduction and to the amazing co-panelists. Wow, it feels super welcoming to have, people to talk to, people to talk to about some things that are, I'm sure, really interesting and unique. And let's also center ourselves in the reality that this has also become very catchy as well, too. So we're going to talk a little bit about why all of those things have kind of manifested. In 2016, and I'm not here to give a lecture in any way, shape, or form, but we'll share a little bit of, let's set the ground and the norms, shall we say, for understanding what it is that we mean when we say Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinx. Because as I'm sure that we will spend time tonight unpacking our own stories, one thing that I know for sure that I can feel confident moving in is that there's not one universal definition. And so let's unpack and talk about, just to set the stage, what that looks like and why that's even a possibility in the first place. So not that long ago, in 2016, the Pew Research Center actually conducted a survey. And for the very first time, of all of the respondents that identified as Latino, Latinx, Latine, 1/4 of them actually identified as Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, or Afro-descendant in some way, shape, or form. And so when I say that it's a catchy topic, I don't mean that tongue in cheek. I mean, it is an identity that is present in many of us, and I'm certain in our own stories we'll share. It isn't just arriving, right? And so what does that look like? Visibility does not always necessarily mean creation at the same point. So another way to flip that is, just because you found it doesn't mean you were the first one to be here. Read between the lines on that one. So knowing that of the captive Africans that were brought over to the Americas during what we know now as the transatlantic slave trade, 5% of those captive African souls made their ways to what we now as the British North American colonies. So that's rough translation. We're looking at a small percentage of the larger population. So where did all those people of African descent end up going? Well, the overwhelming majority of them, if we're speaking statistically and numerically, ended up in what we now refer to as modern day Brazil. And the rest of them were spread all throughout the Francophone and the Lusophone speaking parts of the Caribbean. And yes, all the way into parts of the interior of Mexico, in Veracruz and in Puebla in particular are very, very strong epicenters for Afro-descendiente and Afro-descendant peoples that come from Mexico. And so the whole point was to spend this time discussing very briefly that you will see how regional geography plays a role. Myself experiencing what it means to be Afro-Latino, but living in the context of somebody who was growing up and spent a lot of time in the Southwest. Overwhelmingly in the United States, the overwhelming majority of the respondents, going back to that Pew Research survey, the overwhelming respondents of Latinos, when asked where they resided, the overwhelming respondents of Latinos that out of that 0.25% identified as Afro-Latino, more than half to 2/3 of them resided in the East and the Southern United States. So that tells you that what it means to be Latinx in and of itself, that huge umbrella, is also uniquely experienced regionally as well. And so all of those parts of the story and the thread will come together as to why it is that somebody who may appear to be encoded and read one particular way in certain pockets of society, in certain regions, and in certain times, why all of those things, I'm asking and welcoming everybody to dive into the complexity, to dive into the fact that it is very messy and that there's a lot of threads to pull. And, you know, in closing, there's one quick thing that I'll share that I know in my work and in my time and research with regards to finding commonalities that exist amongst all. When we think about the Chicano experience, particularly in the Southwestern United States, a little differently when we're looking at Los Angeles because of the percentage. When we looked at the Southwest in particular, Chicanos in some senses have had experiences where this phenomenon of ni de aquí ni de allá, I'm not either from here or from there, is constantly playing into this sense of identity. But in the same breath that we can celebrate, certainly that there's a lot of depth and a lot of richness in Chicano culture that is different from traditional Mexican culture or traditional American culture. I'm going to welcome us and invite us to sit into the space of thinking how the complexities and all the different strands that pull apart, to think of what the Afro-Latinx experience looks like in a similar paradigm. So hopefully I will have done a little bit of service in trying to help everybody understand, hey, when we think about what it means to be Afro-Latino, sometimes in some of our stories, you're going to hear a little bit about, well, what side, pick one or the other. And we're here to represent how we can be a both and. It can be a yes and at all times without having to compromise identity. And somewhere in the story, and I don't want to rub the thunder from all the amazing stories that will be shared here today, we'll start to see how cultural norms play a role in the possibility of the discussion that we're having in 22 today as well. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Olga.
Thanks, Omar. That was a great way to start this. So I guess to move on to our first question, this kind of leads into identity, reflections on identity. I'd like for each of you to talk about what country you represent and where are you located. And I think this affects the experience that each of you bring to the table. And how do you identify as well? So it's a two-part question. So whoever wants to start.
I can start. So saludos everyone. So I represent the great country of Cuba, born and raised in Vanessa, Olga, so off of the more on the eastern side of the island, closer to Haiti and Jamaica. And so I'm currently located in Austin, Texas, and I identify as Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, or Afro-Cubano. And that is mostly just based on my upbringing. I've always known I was Black and spoke Spanish. And, you know, my parents never really, my mother who raised us never really shied away from letting us know that, you know, we were both of those two things, even though, you know, some of my peers were mostly African American at a lot of the inner city schools that I attended in Miami, Florida, when we immigrated here. She raised us speaking Spanish at home, and anytime we were outside of the house, we could speak any other language. So that's always been my identity, and culturally, that's how I celebrate life as an Afro-Latino. I'm also in the Afro-Latino, in the Afro-Cuban Lukumi tradition. So that culture was pretty much ingrained in me ever since I've known it for my whole life.
I'll go next, since Cuba y Puerto Rico, un pájaro las dos alas, sisters, right? So I am Puerto Rican, and that has been the way I answered that question for the past 30 plus years. And it's been a process for me to understand this phrase, Afro-Latinx. And that also comes from, as Omar was saying earlier, where I grew up, outside of New York City, in a very diverse community, a lot of Latin people, walking around, everybody's Latin, everyone reads you and codes you and understands, oh, Vanessa's Puerto Rican, Vanessa's from the Caribbean. And the fact that my full blood sister looks like Olga, right? So having a very multicolored family has a different, why do I have a different label than my sister? So it's leaving this very diverse town that's very Latin, and understanding the way the world works on me. It has nothing to do with my language or my food or my music, but the experiences that I have that are shared with everyone else of the African diaspora. And so I've grown into, unlike Ricardo, who perhaps had this for this label, this identity for longer, I've grown into that understanding, learning about these nuances, and really recognizing that it's not just how I feel, but also how I experience the world.
Okay, I'll go next, because you can't have two Caribbean cousins without the third troublemaking cousin. So let's talk a little about Dominican Republic. So I actually grew up in Dominican Republic. I moved to the United States when I was 16. First Florida, and then out to California. I never thought about how the world sees me. I was Dominican for 16 years, surrounded by every single shade that you can imagine. My family is very mixed, although my father is Black in every sense of the word. It was just never a question for us. It was just a reality. It was a fact that half of our family was Black and the other half was not, but we never questioned it. I never questioned how the world saw me until I did a study abroad in East Germany. And one of the professors told my professor, "You did not inform us you were bringing a Black student." There were none of us that were Black. I turned around and started looking, going, who are they talking about? And one of my classmates was like, "They're talking about you." And I was like, "What?" And I really had to take a moment, and I remember that night calling my dad and saying, "Dad, does the world see us as Black? Like, is this how the rest of the world sees us? Because I never questioned it." And that's where my journey began, in understanding that even though I was not placing that label on myself, the outside world was, and that sometimes how I acted was seen through that lens and not necessarily through other lenses. When I moved to California, the Dominican population is about 20 people, 15 of which are my family now. So easy enough to keep track of them. But that means there's not a lot of people that look like me. And so what soon came to be apparent to me was that the Latino experience, the Latinx experience, was so different based on where you found yourself and where you entered that space. And so it took a few years to actually be comfortable saying I was Latina in California. Most of the times people would assume I was mixed Black, and I'd be like, "Yeah, whatever it is you think I am, no problem, let's go with it." But I lost a part of myself. I just felt like I was always trying to fit in. And when was ready to just be whoever it is that I thought I was, that's when I started saying, I can be all these things. I can be a woman, I can be in construction, I can, you know, have nails and hair, and also call myself Afro-Latina and speak in Spanish and throw out a couple of curse words in Spanish when I need to. All of that is good. That is who I am as a package, and that's good. And so my journey took a while for me to come into that moment, but now I'm here and it's hard to shut me up, as Catherine knows. So.
You know, I always love sharing these creation stories because somehow, some way, when we all keep on talking for a while, they start to come like this. There's a lot of synergy, and I can feel that in our metaphorical Brady Bunch cubicle room right now, this digital world that we're residing into. You know, my story, very interestingly enough, I'm going to start with the punchline and I'll work backwards. I have had the following experience. But I thought you were Black. To which the response is usually like, well, damn, this is the world's greatest tan, and it is great. And as an adult, what I really have come to learn is that the story is one about helping people understand and unpack the very limited definitions for whatever they believe Latinx is and whatever they believe Black is, or even white or any other group for that matter of fact. And so I tell people, well, it's not that I'm not Black, it's that your definition of Black is very narrow. And I lived with that because the diaspora, for both the African diaspora and both for the Latino diaspora, has a lot of overlap, and it is not coincidental. But my story begins actually at the age of 5 in kindergarten. I had what was what some scholars have referred to as my racial baptism at that moment. And the quick and short story of it is that I come home one day, crying frantically, asking, and I'm sharing this, and I have never openly shared this part of myself to these many, to these many strangers, we'll call it for now, right? So I'm sharing this in safety. But the part of my story, but northern North Mexico, which is very different because Mexico was very broad, and at that point in my life, I didn't understand that. And so the difficulty of trying to figure out where I fit, I spoke Spanish before I spoke English. It is my native language. But when I moved out here, if you had the opportunity to get a word in with any Dominican when we're speaking, it sounds the way our music does, but that's not how the language was spoken when I moved out here. So I thought that there was something wrong with me. And we'll unpack a little bit more as we go through, but the point that I'm getting at here is that it was a shell, and Afro-Latinidad, before it was even a term, was a space in which I found safety because I knew that I had to create that sense of self, and it was only fueled by what I was seeing at home. But as I matured and I got older, the real fascination was, why are so many people trying to figure out where I fit in the first place? And I really want to anchor that because I know that we represent different industries, or I most certainly am coming from a different field, but in the field of professionalism in which we all operate and navigate in, we know identity politics are what can make or break your career. And so those kinds of things started to play themselves out and realize, where is it that people need to fit me? That's another question too. So a little bit about my story.
Thank you, Omar. Yeah, I think you left us off with a cliffhanger there, right? Identity politics and how they impact our paths, really our whole life, right? It can really impact our income and just our livelihood in general. For myself, my father is Beliceño, so he's from Belize, and my mother is Guatemalan. And I actually didn't learn about Afro-Latinidad until I met the rest of my family back home in Belize, right? And I think for many of us, sometimes that identity is not taught, right? So how, I think for, Ricardo, you mentioned a very empowering moment with your mother, right? Your mother being, allowing you or teaching you, right, the Spanish and in whatever you want outside, but also being aware, making you all aware that you're Black, right? And then Omar, I think you also mentioned a little bit being in touch with yourself and what did that mean? So can you all maybe share about how was identity taught, or what was the learning moment? I think Carmen, you touched a little bit on that. So if there's anything else that can expand on that moment of understanding and identity.
I can talk a little bit more on that. So I think my identity as a Latina was ingrained in me very young, and it had to do everything with my hair. Pelo malo, pelo rizo, nada. You do not leave your house with that curly hair. That is not the way you're going to make it through the world. You will not get a job. You will not get through school. And so a lot of, I knew not to be equal to, say, my cousins who had straight hair, or even my mother who has straight hair. My mom never knew how to do my hair. So until I was 15, my brother and I would go to the barber shop, and my brother and I would get equal haircuts. So until I was 15, I looked just like Michael Jackson. It was amazing. It was a great experience. But that was what my entire identity as a female was. It was that I was not good enough, that my hair was not good enough to grow, that it had to be cut out because there was something not appropriate about it. It was not until I moved to California, where there is no humidity. And so I shave half my hair, I do braids, I do curls. If you know me, you know I'll show up one day with straight hair. I love doing all of it. I love my hair, and I love that I can do that. And so I feel like it is a burden, but it's also been my opportunity to free myself and to fully express myself whichever way I want.
Well, I think Omar said something earlier that's really powerful. And I think we all knew we were Black because we have mirrors, right? But it's that question of what's that definition? And maybe a lot of us, a lot of the world, or at least in the States, Black equals African American. And for me, I'm not African American because I'm not American. I mean, technically I am because I'm from a colony, but that's another story for another panel and another problem. But that cultural separation, right? I'm not African American because I'm not American, and that phrase was actually invented to stop using the phrase Black, for the African American community to embrace both America and the African culture. I know that I've always known that I'm Black, and my sister is not. But in Puerto Rico, as in many Latin countries, we like to tell the story that it's a harmonious mixing of the three races, right? The Spanish, the Native, and the African who made up our culture. And in a lot of ways, that's true, right? There, the typical music, the bomba plena, right? All of that typical music has these African roots, but we hear these stories as a part of our cultural heritage, no matter what we look like. And for me, it was that moment, that realization was literally when I was in college. I had left this really diverse town where everyone looks at me and says, "Oh, Vanessa's Latin," and someone said Vanessa's Black, and another student was like, "No, she's not." And he's like, "Yes, she is. She's not African American, but she's Black." And so these two white people are talking about me, and I realized that was a disconnect, that my whole life I had equated these two, this one subset of Blackness to the whole.
Yeah, that was great, Vanessa. You really hit me with the "I'm not African American, I'm Black," because I thought I was crazy for always saying that for a long time. I'm sure people got tired of it and still get tired of it. And for me, the way that identity was taught was in the song and in the music and the drums, right? And so my mother would always take us to these to these religious ceremonies, to these religious parties of Santeria and Nukumi. And being a young rebellious kid that I was at the time, I always wore black when you're supposed to wear like light colored clothes at these kind of events. So maybe that was my future in architecture right there, when I knew that I really wanted to be an architect by wearing all black. But in all seriousness, you know, that goes into another story about how I really got into architecture. But that identity of like, esta tu música, siempre rézale a los santos, you know, tu ángel de la guardia es el Eguá, you know, que te bendiga o batalá, like growing up in that sphere of traditional practices, that led me, that it reinforced in me from the jump that I was black. I mean, I ended up going to an HBCU first. I mean, I knew I was blackity black from the beginning, like that was it. And, you know, I only ended up going to PWI for a grad school. And that's when I realized I'm like, oh shit, this is how much being black is really not celebrated at Texas A&M. Despite, you know, being where it's located, that was a done deal. But, you know, that sense of identity of being Afro-Latino carried me all the way through HBCU, where I came across a lot of African Americans who'd be like, man, you learn Spanish, right? And I'm like, no, I speak Spanish. Like, are you for real? So then I had to stop and give them a lesson on how slavery happened and how like we're just a boat stop away. And I say that jokingly, but I'm also half serious when I say that, because if you go back and you remember what Omar said about the disbursement of the diaspora, I almost typed in the chat and then I didn't. I said, I'm going to say that for whenever it's my turn. But basically anywhere with a boat that has a port, you're going to find Africans there. You're going to find people of the diaspora there. And so it always amazes me that, you know, there, you know, people are like, oh no existen africanos en Mexico, no existen, Africans don't exist here. I'm like, does your country have a port? It likely does. You have Black people there. You do. And so, you know, I'm going off on that tangent, but, you know, that sense of identity, it meant a lot to me in college because I was able to defend my Latinidad and my Blackness at the same time. And I got into a lot of fights because I told people I'm probably more Black than you because I know my ancestors. Because it's something in my culture to, when you do your prayers, your moyuba, you always recite the name of your ancestors, those that died, that passed away before you. So I have a long list that I recite in my prayers, and you know, it pissed a lot of people off. And, you know, maybe it wasn't the full truth that I knew all of my ancestors, but I knew a hell of a lot more. And I knew, because of the traditions, the way that they're passed down by word of mouth, that stayed and resonated with me. That's not something that, as African Americans, are always so, they can lean on, because just how the way that slavery happened here in the United States was a lot different than how it happened in Cuba and different parts of the Caribbean. So I'm always grateful, siempre con mi orgullo latino, always a proud Afro-Latino.
But also, like, back to definitions, right? You know, the definition of Black, but now the definition of Latinx, right? That what does it mean to be Latin? And it's, you know, we're not all Jennifer Lopez's, right? There's a lot more diversity in what it means to be Latin than that.
I have one question though, that strikes me as interesting. And tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the overprevalence of the question goes in one direction more so than in the other. And this is what I mean. There's always more of a question as to who's Black, but the response is, well, let me show you how not Black I am. And here's what I mean. In the Dominican Republic, well, let me say this, in Brazil, there are at least, and I said this in our pre-panel meeting, there are about 108 different characterizations between what in Portuguese they define as absolute Black, whatever that may be, and absolute white, whatever that may be. So that means there's a lot of gradation. And from a systems approach, I look at that and I say to myself, I wonder why that is. Why so many people trying to get away from absolute one thing or absolute another? And I see the preponderance of the folks that are trying to run away from an identity. It's a lot of people trying to not be Black. And I want to know why that is. what's wrong with including the bigger, this is a rhetorical question, by the way, because I know we don't have any immediate.
I was gonna say, Omar, you know why that is.
Rhetorical, yeah, well, tongue in cheek, but it serves a function, and that's my point. That precisely, Vanessa, what you just said right now is exactly what my point is. Because there's nothing wrong with saying, sí, soy Latino, y también soy negro, ¿y qué? Or is there?
I think it depends on context. You know, I think as and Omar, I'll just talk about us Dominicans, and I won't generalize for others, but it's not the same for me to be in California, to be like, yeah, sí, soy Latina, y soy negra también, can't deny it. I mean, look, at the end of the day, even if you don't know what I am, you're not going to say I'm white. That is not going to be where you go with me. I will always be a person of color, and you will make assumptions based on where you are in life. In Dominican Republic, however, when we go home, we're not going to be sitting there going, sí, Dominicano, negro. The conversation changes, right? Based on that cultural context and what's seen as, and I would say our country has a bit of a difference with that than like Cuba does, where Cuba and Puerto Rico, they have some acceptance to that we haven't done in the public sense yet. You know,
100%.
At your house, you might do it, but in the public sense, it's still straight hair, blonde, blue eyes all day long. That's how you get anywhere in life, you know?
So
and that's sad.
I'm going to say this openly and publicly as my own personal opinion. But Carmen, I 100% agree with you, so much so that currently, right now, in the Dominican Republic, and we don't have to get into the geopolitics of this, but just so that we're anchored in understanding how powerful of a statement that is. In La República Dominicana, and I'd be glad to talk to anybody offline about this because this is what my graduate work was. This idea of negritude, of what it means to be Black in the Dominican Republic specifically, is not only just Black. Black is not Black in the Dominican Republic. Black is synonymous with Haitian. And Haitian is treated a very different way because there is no, and hear me on this historically, there is no, Haiti is the only successful slave revolt in the history of humanity. Period, point, the end. And one of the greatest difficulties that country has been punished for was for that liberty at the hands of their own hands. They won their own victory. And so in the Dominican Republic, there is this perverted relationship between the two. One side sees themselves as one whole set of people, the other does not. And part of that is because now using Puerto Rico, using República Dominicana, and using Cuba, the institution of slavery and what Blackness meant in that society was very different in all three. The social mobility that on the eastern end of the island, modern day Hispaniola and Dominican Republic, was very different. And so what it meant to be Black didn't mean the same thing as it did on the western end in the Francophone speaking, where sugarcane plantations were very, very significantly rough, harsh slave conditions, where the average slave only lived about 7 to 9 years. And so all of that factors a role. There's another thing that factors a role too, when we look at it in the modern paradigm and in the context: class. In Latino America, who gets to determine in some senses who they are is also el quien tiene plata. Whoever has money in that environment, and I would argue even larger, but again, we're not going Marxist here, or are we? But
yet.
But the point is that in all these different paradigms, it's really important for us to remember that it operates different. And of course, gender runs through all of this. So to the person who said earlier about intersectionality, our entire discourse, as I see it at least, is intersectional in the purest sense. It has to be, or otherwise there's no real honest academic analysis and assessment of the real situation at hand if it's not intersectional at best. Olga, Catherine, I'm not going to get you too fired, am I?
I was waiting to see if something else to say. Hey, no, that's what we need. We need a lot of facts here, and hear it from you. Who else, you know? So yeah, you guys, wow, I'm simply blown away. I'm just listening and learning and just trying to listen more. That's what I'm trying to do. So now that we've talked a little bit about how you all identify and how, whether that's been a continuous journey for you all or it's something recent, learning it. And I think the intention of this is to encourage other people as well that may already be on their journey or are starting, to kind of help them out as well, and just see that there are other people that are just like you that are going through this as well. So speaking on representation, so now we want to kind of shift it in a little bit. So I want to see, you've all had different stories on being the only one, only Afro-Latinx within your city or school and so forth. So did you have any role models or someone that looked like you in your career? And by look like you, I guess it can be whatever you want to call it, someone else that literally looked like you or another Afro-Latinx in the spaces that you were present at.
And we really asked this question because you all play such a pivotal role in the fields that you are in, that it is even an honor to know each and one of you, to invite you to this space, right? I know that Carmen, for example, you're pursuing a PhD, and not many of us get there. And it's really inspiring to hear that there's not only an Afro-Latina, but also a woman, right, who is pursuing higher ed and really breaking those barriers. Vanessa, you're an academic yourself, right? You're an instructor, and along with Omar as well. And Ricardo, you have just accomplished so many milestones, right? Just most recently, being part of LEA, but also getting awards and transitioning into a firm that really supports your well-being and supports your work as well. So what does it really mean, I think, when we really ask about role models, and what does it look like you? Because we know how the scarcity of seeing each other in our fields, and I, for myself, meeting Carmen was just, a big deal for me and really inspiring. And so I wonder what that means. What if you had a role model, or if you are that role model for someone, or if you are opening that door for people to reach out to you?
I don't want to be the first one to talk, but I saw I got silent, so I'm like, let me break the silence real quick. I still haven't met another Afro-Latino like me, and I've been friends with Latinos that they just don't identify with Afro-Latino, and I'll leave it at that. Which is why I can't give them any credit for even motivating me to continue being in the career. I've been having to push myself, honestly, because of the lack of representation, and every day it's a struggle to perform and just to overperform your peers, not my peers, but overperform for myself, right? Because there's already, despite all the awards and accolades and all that stuff looks good on paper and all that stuff, and you're happy when you get recognized for it. But at the end of the day, like, as soon as I get off of work, I'm still a Black man to the rest of the world. So for me, it's continuously just pushing through the barrier, hoping the key word in all of this is that when there are other Afro-Latinos, Latinas, Afro-Latinx, however that individual wants to identify themselves within the field of architecture, that they'll think that there were other people like him or her or them that that made the strides. Because I don't think it was until I think I met Vanessa I think she reached out after we did that panel in NOMA. And also I was like, wow, look at this, another Afro-Latina in architecture. And then, I met another guy, Sergio Max, in Seattle or Washington. He's also Cuban. I'm like, man, look at this. Everybody's just popping out the woodwork when it's not popular to be Black. And so for me, it's just continuously pushing and just continue being my most authentic self as much as I can, knowing that I'm not perfect, but just knowing that I can continue to push through those obstacles, and maybe lay down the groundwork for someone else. So that's what continues to push me. No mentor, sorry.
Ricardo, I'm just gonna say, I hope there aren't others like you. I wanna say that I know the one and only Ricardo, and that you're one of a kind, and we get to be in your space with you. I'm gonna echo what you said, no mentor for me, nothing. What always kept me going was my dad. My father went to a Texas A&M in the 60s. As a Black Latino, he navigated spaces that I can't even imagine. And I get to hear some amazing stories about what Texas was like in the 60s for a Black man. So so he was always my inspiration. He was an engineer by training, so I always knew I could be something. I didn't know what, but my dad always kept me going because I knew he did it in worse conditions than what I was doing. I would say that actually, I will put this out there. I see some names I know. This is a safe space. Don't take it out of context. But where I found the hardest place to actually get mentors is when you find people like you. I've actually experienced more negativity and more people trying to put you into little pockets when they start looking like you. When you start identifying with someone because of what you look like, they somehow need to put you into a pocket immediately. And I've found that to be the harshest reality within the architecture profession that I've experienced. So I've gotten the worst treatment out of women of color than I have from white men and white women. And that to me is just something that I'm striving to change. I don't want that to be what the next generation actually experiences in any way.
Well, I think that's how power holds on to power, right? Pitting us against each other. You know, when you have those conversations about gender, you know, simply gender, they say the same thing, right? That it's women pitted against women that you get, because that's how power holds on, right? And Tiffany Montañez put in a chat a good question, you know, about these buckets, this title of Latinx that covers a lot of countries, nationalities, you know, sovereign nations. And I think that's a challenge that we have, I think, so that we have, each country has their own struggles, right? That has their own agendas, but you're trying to put all of these unique experiences, unique backgrounds into one lump. And then you're fighting, you know, we mentioned identity politics, right? And you're fighting each other for opportunities, or it's a power play, which is unfortunate. And I'm glad that you're working with the rest of us to change it for the next generation, because, you know, I think we're all like, no, I don't have anyone who mentored me who looked like me. And I mentioned earlier that I grew up in this bubble, this bubble of like my Latinness, and I didn't have to think about anything else. And when I left that bubble and realized what America really was, I had a lot of experiences where I just didn't fit, and I didn't understand why until much later. So I would leave these spaces, like walk away from opportunities, because I just wasn't, I felt I didn't belong. And it took me some time to look back and realize why that was. And just watching the movie Hidden Figures, there's a line that always sticks with me, where Janelle Monáe's character, Mary Jackson, is petitioning to go take her night classes, and she says, "I can't change the color of my skin, so I have no choice but to be the first."
How am I supposed to follow that? Oh, geez. Here's the difficulty in what I'm seeing, because I'm a person who likes to look at patterns and trends. And the truth of the matter is that all panelists coming from very different experiences, and myself coming from a completely different field, guess what? Par for course. Also didn't have anybody that looked like me. And there's an element to how much more difficult it can be sometimes when you're pigeonholed, and sometimes the difficulties psychologically, if at the very least, that other people who look like you and identify with you sometimes may not always present themselves to be your allies, and that can hurt a lot. More on that in a bit. I want to say that it's very easy to be reductive. It's, I think, very human nature for us to take the paradigm on how race and class and everything operates here in the United States. If that's the space, certainly, I don't want to speak for any of my co-panelists, but for myself, that's the position I'm speaking from. And I want to take a step back and just make it very clear that hopefully my intentions have landed that it's a lot, and that the very notion of how race and class operate in and of itself, forget about nation to nation, from one corner of the town to the next, from one corner of your office building to the next, how it's understood is very different. So all of these things are constantly in flux. So with that, mine is a little bit interesting because I didn't have anybody who was there, but remember, I'm coming from the field of education where the language and the discourse is all liberal, progressive, and about yay, us, and in language, but not in practice. You know, I am one of very few, and just in my own district alone, I am one of 3 Black. I am one of 4 Black or people of color, excuse me, that are site administrators, that are school principals. We have 20 schools. It's a small district, but nonetheless, you get the point. And so all of these things, there's a common thread that kind of binds us all together. And so what do you do when you are looking for, and to Vanessa's point, like, I guess you got to be the first. But I would also say that influences and impacts for me, well, certainly my family, I've been very blessed. You know, when people ask me, well, who's Black? Which one of your parents? Yes. Well, which one's Dominican? Yes. Well, are they Latino? Yes, because both of my parents, right? That, and then I can also say as a Dominican, living where I live in Phoenix, baseball played a huge role. Because for the very first time, when I first moved out here, and no one knew what a Dominican was on the East Coast and in New York, of course, come on, Washington Heights. But out here, nobody knew. And it wasn't until I could start saying baseball, and the irony of saying this, Sammy Sosa, of all people, was such a huge figure for people at that point in time in the 90s, for them to begin to conceptually think of, on the Southwestern United States, that is, where this little island is, which is not so little, in the middle of the Caribbean. And so those kinds of things started informing how I felt about myself. But as a professional, I think I gotta co-sign with all my colleagues. There really haven't been that many people. And I hope, and I'll say this, my hope and my prayer is that to whomever has an opportunity to, whomever we have an opportunity to, you know, speak with, I hope and pray that they don't have to say the same things that all 4 of us have had to say. That's my biggest prayer.
I will say, to kind of counter the loneliness that it can feel, I've and it's unfortunate, but I've kind of separated myself, right? So I have found support in women in architecture. I have found support in Latin people in architecture. I have found support with Black people in architecture, and these separate pockets and these separate identities. No one else who brings it all together, but at least that can address the parts and pieces, so that it isn't quite as lonesome as it could be. Because if they can see it, they can be it, right? And finding someone who's at least somewhat like you is, it helps.
Vanessa, I like what you said about, you know, being able to pull from different organizations, at least within architecture. I know for me, there wasn't a Afro-Latinos in architecture, but there was a Latinos in architecture. And at first there was some hesitancy to have me involved because, not the color of my skin, what are you guys thinking about? Because of, because I was Black, and I'm like, well, I'm also Latino. So I identify as Latino, so I should, you know, I could lead the organization. And, you know, the people that I worked with never batted an eye. It was just everyone else who was in power who wasn't sure. They didn't know what my ability to lead was. And so I like to think that, at least within architecture, hearing you say that you found comfort in women in architecture, Latinos in architecture, and Black people in architecture, I feel like, our NOMA, National Organization of Minority Architects, which is mostly always Black architects, that we haven't even found any freedom in that either, which is something that I've reached out to the leadership about. That, hey, isn't that weird that, as Black as I am, that I haven't really found any comfort in this organization that's also supposed to be representative of minorities, and Afro-Latino is a minority. You're Black, you can just scratch it off and you're good. You're a NOMA. And I often feel like, we could do better in that respect with staying in touch with one another. Because I would hate to see people like Carmen driven away just by someone's sheer of wanting to be the token at their firm. That's the most ridiculous shit I've ever heard. Wanting to compete with one another. All these years, our ancestors having to sacrifice all the things that they did. Some not even wanting to make it to this land, or wanting to make it to Cuba or to the Dominican or to Puerto Rico. And then you have someone else who's just like, well, I was here and now I was the only, Afro-Latino or the Black person in the room, and you're taking up that space. I think that is so incredibly selfish, and it's definitely counter to opening the door for the next generation to follow. And I do this for anyone that I bring into any firm that I've referred to. I look out for them, regardless of the color of their skin. And I think that that's what we need to be doing as well. I would definitely go out of my way to see more Black people in architecture, especially more Afro-Latinos. But we are so seldom few and far in between. Even at Tuskegee, like I was one of two that I knew. One was a Dominican, but she was in the history department. So it was, I think the onus is really on us, as if we say that we are these inspiring leaders within our profession and with our community, it's up to us to continue to open the door for someone else.